Robin, are you in Australia or in Australia? Right?
No. They don't allow anybody to travel now to Australia for the past year, and they're still closed. So, but I live in the U.S. anyway. I'm in Colorado now. Yeah,
Colorado.
Okay, Erica, now you can start. We are sorry for this delay. Ready to start.
No worry. Good afternoon. I am Erica Buscardo, and we are today here to present our last of a series of 4 seminars that were organized by myself and my colleague, Eraldo Matricardi, within the postgraduate program in Forest Sciences at the University of Brasília. These seminars were planned to focus on environmental challenges and how they were basically planned to discuss where forest sciences could contribute to solutions. In the first seminar, we saw 2 talks on the carbon cycle. The first by John Grace of the University of Edinburgh, and the second one, we saw the use of remote sensing for the quantification of the carbon cycle by Luis Aragão at UnB. In the second one, we had two talks on global change. The first one on global change and sustainable development in Amazonia, in the University of Maryland. And the second one on climate change by Paulo Artacho. In the third seminar, we had 2 talks on ecosystem services and the potential mechanism to finance them by David Skoll of the University of Michigan and Carlos Eduardo Young of the University of Rio de Janeiro. Today, we have here with us Professor Robin Chazdon of the University of Connecticut and Professor Carlos Perez of the University of East Anglia. And they will speak about restoration and conservation. On the panel, we have Professor Reuber Brandão and Eraldo Matricardi of the University of Brasília, Daniel Vieira of Embrapa Brasília, and Geraldo Fernandes of the University of Minas Gerais. I would like to remind you that we are live on YouTube. The event will last 2 hours. We shall have first the talk by Robin entitled Governance of Restoration Initiative in Brazil. And following our talk, Carlos will speak about conservation lessons of key Amazonian biodiversity knowns and unknowns. After the 2 talks, we will have a panel discussion, including answering questions from those who are following us on YouTube. I would like to thank very much our speakers and the members of the panel for accepting our invitation. And I shall now introduce Robin, the first of our speakers. Robin Chazdon is part-time research professor at the Tropical Forest and People Research Centre at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, Australia, and Professor Emerita in the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology Department at the University of Connecticut. Her research focuses on tropical forest regeneration, forest and landscape restoration, drivers of land use change, and ecosystem services provided by forests. She is the principal consultant of Forestation International, LLC, a consulting group established to support the implementation of forest and landscape restoration. She recently served as the executive director of the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation, and as director of the Research Coordination Network's partners, People and Reforestation in the Tropics. She is a senior associate with the International Institute for Sustainability in Rio de Janeiro. She serves on the advisory board of UnT.org, Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment, and the Nature-Based Solution Initiative. She's an active member of the FAO Task Force on Best Practices for the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. She is the author or co-author of over 200 peer-reviewed publications. So, Robin, I give you the word. The floor is yours. You can go ahead and share your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Erica, and also Eraldo for inviting me to participate. So I am not really known for my work with governance, but this is a topic I have become increasingly interested in and working with a group of colleagues. So I will share the screen and begin. So first I want to acknowledge that this presentation is based on a paper that was just completed and draft that's going to be part of a special issue. And it is written in Portuguese, so it will be available to all of you eventually once it goes through the review process, and called the Forest Governance Dossier. And Christina Adams from the University of Sao Paulo has been very involved in this. And I'd like to acknowledge the co-authors of the paper and how this is all part of the presentation today. As you can see on the bottom, all people who are very, very knowledgeable about restoration in Brazil, and particularly about the organizations and initiatives that have been taking place in Brazil. So I want to link this with the UN Decade because that was originally part of the request in writing this paper. And that this is important because this is a global effort now, and it is one that is being executed with the real intent of bringing about change. And the whole focus of the UN Decade is on preventing, halting, and reversing the degradation of ecosystems worldwide. This is very important. Preventing and halting is part of the UN Decade goal on ecosystem restoration. It's not just about fixing things that have been broken, but it's about preventing further damage. The goals are threefold. One is to enhance global, regional, national, and local commitments to do these things. Second, to increase how we can get multiple benefits from successful restoration. And third, to really work on enhancing knowledge and applying knowledge of ecosystem from all sources, including indigenous knowledge, and to mainstream this information within public and private sector decision-making. So the goal is to really go deep and change systematically, change what's happening. And the vision of the decade recognized 6 main barriers to achieving the goals of the decade. And they're public awareness, political will, legislation and policy, technical capacity, financing restoration, and scientific research. All of these aspects need to be part of contributing to the goals of the decade. And in the strategy for the UN Decade, they discussed 3 main pathways to overcoming those barriers. One is a global movement. I'm not going to describe all of the points here, but the idea is this is really about changing society and embedding the efforts to undertake restoration and prevent land degradation within all sectors of society. The second is focusing on political will and policy change. That's mostly what I'm going to be addressing today. And the third is on enhancing technical capacity, building capacity, and undertaking research to address how we can do all of this better. How can we integrate knowledge into practice, and that in ways that really protect the rights of people as well. So that's about the UN decade. And they, in the bullet point there about the political will, they talk about some specific aspects. One is how can we generate this political will and the support that's needed to really bring about restoration at a large scale, and good restoration at that. One is to assist societal leaders who are already champions of restoration to really gain force behind these champions. Second, to amend and align legislation and policy frameworks. Restoration has not had its own policy framework, and it's about time that we figured out how to do that. Third, to really focus on cross-sectoral dialogues, bringing people together from different parts of society to discuss how to move forward and how to reach the common ground. Unlocking and reorienting finance away from degradative activities toward restorative activities. And this other one I'm going to talk about a lot today, creating enabling factors for restoration. What does that mean? How do we do that? And all of these aspects really come down to governance, which is really about how people act and behave and how they work together. And that is the essential bottom line, sort of the foundation of being able to do all of these things. So we've already identified several governance challenges for forest and also for forest and landscape restoration. And these apply also to non-forest ecosystems like savanna and cerrado, as well as coastal ecosystems and marine ecosystems. But I've sort of built this talk around forest restoration, but these ideas apply across the board. First, there's these three main categories of challenges. One is that there's this poor alignment across levels and sectors of government. By levels of government, I mean, federal level, then you've got subnational or state or provincial level. And then below that, you have municipal level. And then even below that, you have local or just local sort of neighborhood level. Those are not aligned. And also there's various sectors of government are poorly aligned to bring about restoration. We have conservation is often a separate ministry from agriculture, and then education and culture are another one, if they exist anymore. And then these groups don't talk to each other. Law enforcement, when they do, they can do wonderful things. Second category is the fact that there's a lot of environmental and social heterogeneity in the world, and that there are conflicts across different groups about what the objectives should be, and also the approaches for restoration. And those aren't going to work everywhere because of the heterogeneity. And that is inherently a challenge that needs to be worked on. That's why we need the dialogue. Third, there really has the enabling conditions for restoration and for building that capacity for good implementation are really lacking in many cases. So I'm viewing these as governance challenges. There's also a really huge important need to focus on knowledge sharing and capacity building. And when I say that, I'm referring not just to technical capacity, but to all forms of capital, enhancing human capital, enhancing social capital, natural capital, financial capital, and physical capital. All of these aspects need to be part of the knowledge sharing and capacity building efforts, and because they are all integrated. And finally, we need to integrate levels of government, and that's what we call polycentric governance. That is, we can't, there needs to be linkage between what's happening locally and at the landscape scale with what's happening nationally and globally, and finding the synergies and the support mechanisms to enhance activities at all of those levels is really what polycentric governance is all about. And that's the key to scaling up restoration processes. A lot of that involves mapping stakeholders and understanding who are the relevant actors who need to be engaged in the decision-making process for any restoration activity. And also, we cannot ignore the private sector. The private sector can and must be a hugely important partner with restoration efforts, not just restoration being done by the corporate sector, but also creating partnerships with public agencies and companies, and really bringing back the values to society that these companies want to contribute to in a good way. And one example is with this company called Guayaki, which makes and markets mate and mate drinks. They market them here in the United States, and the proceeds from their business go toward restoring Atlantic forests and regenerating mate trees in the understory as well, creating livelihoods, nurturing tradition. All of these activities can be accomplished through private sector partnerships. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on 5 different types of restoration activities in Brazil. And I've really learned a lot from this engagement, from working with my collaborators here. And we put all of this together to demonstrate how the governance of restoration has actually been happening in Brazil. So the first category are looking at national legislation and national level policies. The second is more looking at the lower levels of government initiatives by states and also by regional and municipality governance. Third are sort of non-governmental platforms, which are multiple stakeholder platforms and coalitions that could involve some government actors, but involve a whole range of actors and sectors, either at national or subnational levels. So there's 2 levels of those platforms. And the fourth are platforms for providing information about restoration suppliers and actors, supply chains, and monitoring as well. And fifth is activity associated with multiple regional seed collection and planting networks. So I'll quickly sort of give you a tour through all of these different activities. It may be a little bit fast, but I want you to get a sense of just the scale and extent of what's going on in Brazil, many of which things you may not know about, or many you already know about. And talk about how these activities relate to 7 different features of governance. One is the importance of decentralized, transparent, and inclusive governance. The second is involving multiple sectors. Third is coordinating the strategies of monitoring and collaborating, cooperation among members. The fourth is democratized and transparent communication. So not just doing, but communicating about what is being done. Fifth, respect for traditional knowledge and indigenous peoples. Sixth is consideration of the cultural, productive, ecological, and social issues. So there needs to be a multi-benefit of restoration. And seventh is how can we integrate these actions and policies at local, municipal, state, and national levels to achieve polycentric governance. So keeping these things in mind, I'm going to go through a set of different initiatives. The first group will be global, national, and subnational restoration initiatives. I'm not going to go through the global initiatives, although I did tell you quite a bit about the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. Sorry, this slide is in Portuguese. I'm going to talk about a few government-level programs and then some subnational government programs as well. So the Forest Code has been operating in Brazil for a very, very long time, actually starting in the 1930s, has gone through a lot of changes over time, including the most recent change in 2012. This is just to show you that Brazil has a long history of federal level forest and habitat governance. And most recently, it's now not just the forest, it's about native vegetation. So they're really expanding the scope of these policies. And this is really at the basis of all restoration in Brazil, because there's been a long history of developing restoration for compliance to the Forest Code. I'm not going to go into the details of the Forest Code itself, but this is a really good document. There's several documents in Portuguese as well. Oops. But one of the sort of foundation of the government program was launched most recently in 2017. It's called Planaveg, the National Plan for the Recovery of Native Vegetation. And it is a very ambitious plan for recovery of degraded areas, covering all of the biomes in Brazil. Unfortunately, during the recent Bolsonaro administration, they have basically taken Planaveg off the table, even though it did become a law or a formal government initiative. So part of the reason for the importance of all of the other layers of governance for restoration in Brazil is because if we rely only on the federal initiatives, we're in trouble because political change can reverse some of the progress that is being made. So it's very important to have activities at all levels of the government. The goal of Planaveg was to restore at least 12 million hectares, and they had a plan for laying this out starting from 2017 to 2030, all in compliance with the Forest Code, also including some additional areas that could be restored. So it is a very ambitious plan. So now I'm going to shift to some more subnational levels. This is a program in the municipality of Extrema in Minas Gerais. And the background of my slide is from this area. The project started in 2007, called Conservador das Águas. And it really involved not just the people within the municipality, but also many different non-government organizations operating in Brazil, including SOS Mata Atlântica, the Nature Conservancy, IUCN, and WRI. And this is an indicator already that to achieve the kind of goals we want to with restoration, we need to have partnerships and we need to have broad engagement of different organizations that can each tap into their strengths and contribute. The main objectives of this project were focused on water quality and water sources due to extreme water shortages that were developing in the area that supplies water for Sao Paulo largely and the surrounding areas. They wanted to increase forest cover in sub-watersheds and to implement little micro corridors within the region to improve management of vegetation, sort of integrated management of soil and water in the watershed, and to really ensure environmental sustainability of the practices that they were doing by directly providing financial incentives to rural landowners. And that was a key innovation of this program, that it was really focused on preventative rather than corrective action. So it wasn't designed to immediately reverse a problem, but to really prevent further problems. And it was largely based on volunteers and achieving the goals that everyone felt the need to improve and maintain water quality, supplies, and water sources. It's something everybody could agree on. The program was flexible and allowed for payments based on the achievement of goals that were pre-established. So the payments did require that the efforts were made, and they were made during and after the project implementation. So this rapidly became a well-known project and won a lot of awards and received a lot of attention within Brazil. And it was really the first project of its kind. And even just during the first 12 years, they involved 224 contracts with landowners and protected forests in over 6,000 hectares. And it also inspired another program called Conservador da Mantiqueira. And the Mantiqueira is in the states of Minas Gerais, Sao Paulo, and Rio de Janeiro, in the whole Serra de Mantiqueira. And this was a similar, broad, larger spatial area, actually, than the Conservador das Águas project. And the Conservador das Águas project actually helped in the planning of this project. So again, you're beginning to see this real partnership. We're all in this together mentality, and using expertise and experience to help other initiatives get going. So it's really a collective initiative. This is very much in process now, involving over 400 municipalities. This program, the Nascentes program, is from the government of the state of Sao Paulo, and it's focused also on mostly on riparian forestry, riparian forest conservation and restoration to protect and conserve water resources and biodiversity. They also are trying to optimize investments to promote restoration of native vegetation in Sao Paulo. And it has a very strong governance framework with a steering committee with 12 different secretariats of the state involved. So here you're getting that collaboration across different state agencies, which is really key. So this can happen at the state level. They have already reached the goal of 20,000 hectares in restoration from broad participation from various sectors. So this program has been viewed as very successful. And this is another state program from Espírito Santo, which is also focused on restoration and hydrological resources through conservation and recovery of forest cover, focusing on providing income for rural producers through payments for environmental services. So this is a theme that we're seeing in numerous initiatives. The financial support for the farmers helps them to acquire inputs, seedlings or fencing or fertilizer for planting new areas with forests. It's a very ambitious project to recover 80,000 hectares. And it's also become very well known and has served as a model for how ecosystem service payments can be applied toward restoration and improving lives for rural producers. Now I'd like to turn to what we're calling multiple stakeholder or coalitions. And these are both at the national level as well as subnational level. The national level ones are here in the green shading, and these are 3 regional or subnational efforts. So very key at the national level is the Brazilian Society for Ecological Restoration, or SOBRE. It says my unstable internet. Sorry, it'll come back. This was founded in 2014 and is a nonprofit association of scientists, but also educators and people who work with ecological restoration all over Brazil. So also practitioners. All of the members who are involved in SOBRE share a goal of expanding knowledge, training of human resources, and providing subsidies for public policies and restoration of a range of different ecosystems in Brazil. It originally came out of a demand from REBRE, which was a Brazilian network for ecological restoration, to actually form this society. And it has a very representative governance with a board of directors and 10 counselors, which are elected by the members, and a decentralized governance plan based on developing regional chapters and groups that are organized for action within different biomes. And then they coordinate efforts to implement both science and practice of restoration in particular regions of the country. So it is nationally based, but its activities are regionally based. Another really important multi-stakeholder platform is operating more at the regional level. And the most famous one and the first one is the Atlantic Forest Restoration Pact, known in Brazil as the Pacto. This pact has a very clear organizational structure as well, broad representative governance that are elected every 2 years. They have an executive secretariat. They have a coordinating board, a general coordinator from all of the member institutions. And then they have working groups, which are actually the work that they do is done within these working groups. The Pacto began in 2009, and it is one of the largest bottom-up multi-sector restoration movements in the world. It really has shined a light on what bottom-up coalitions can accomplish. They have a very big goal to restore 15 million hectares within Atlantic forest by 2050. And they've already achieved the first million, mostly through natural regeneration. They have more than 300 members from different sectors that are active throughout Brazil in the Atlantic forest region and in the restoration and reforestation supply chain across 17 different states. And they have specialists that work together in these working groups. And they're really building bridges through these working groups that are bringing different sectors together to sort of consolidate strategies. And a key mode of their activity is this network of regional units. So again, decentralizing. Each regional unit has partners who are engaged and who are expert within that region. But they also are having a national influence by showing essentially how effective this governance can be in bringing people together toward a common goal. So successful that they've been trying to replicate this model elsewhere in Brazil. And in 2017, the Aliança pela Restauração da Amazônia was created, the Alliance for Restoration in the Amazon. And this also took on the role of being a multi-stakeholder, a multi-sector coalition that focused on the Amazon. So the Alliance is really taking on a role as a catalyst and amplifier, bringing together people, reconciling interests and conflicts, and integrating actions to expand the scale and efficiency of forest restoration. And they also are doing a lot of activities on communication, disseminating knowledge and information on tropical forestry, agroforestry, forest restoration. They're supporting fundraising. They're trying to boost the economic aspects of forest restoration, stimulating the whole supply chain and production chain, and including private sector in all of these efforts as well. They're also working toward formulating and implementing better public policies to favor and to create those enabling conditions for forest restoration, and also providing protocols and tools. So this is knowledge generation as well as policy engagement. They currently have, it's still a relatively young organization, but they already have 80 member institutions from all sectors of the government, and their secretariat is Conservation International within Brazil. They recently produced a really nice report and also a map that shows all of the restoration initiatives in forest landscapes across Amazonia, as well as, and it actually just describes the different restoration approaches that are being used in each of these cases. So this is a very early start to understanding what activities are already underway in Amazonia and beginning to coordinate them. And recently, in 2020, another multi-sector network was formed that's focused on the Cerrado biome. This network has about 100 participants. It's called Auraticum. And they're also following the same model of integrating different sectors and different types of vegetation within the Cerrado, including productive sectors of agriculture and forestry, and strengthening local organizations, providing technical support, and also working to foster better public policies. So you're seeing a very common theme here, but these types of networks function best at the regional level, but they can have a lot of influence on policies at the national level, or they should. Finally, let's talk about seed networks, which are also phenomenal ways of bringing people together with the proper governance arrangements. The Xingu Seeds Network began their work producing native seeds on a very large scale in 2007. That involves 450 different seed collector groups across 19 municipalities in the Xingu watershed and 30 different organizations. And over these 14 years that they've been operating, they have their work has led to recovery of more than 6.8 thousand hectares of degraded areas, and they're now expanding to other regions of the Cerrado and the Amazon. So it has really, really been effective and had a lot of outcomes. And they have been collecting seed from over 220 native tree species. And this activity has benefited more than 560 collectors and generated income that is being transferred directly to the community. So it is really helping to support the livelihoods of many people, including many indigenous people who are engaged in this activity. And this is just a diagram showing all of the different activities that this network is generating. Here's sort of the end result in forest restoration, but they're creating a whole supply chain for restoration, starting with the training seed collectors, going out and doing the collection, drying, and all of the processing of the seed, the transport, the storage, transport, and then the commercialization of the seed, and then the distribution of seed to projects. This is all a part of Muvuka, or direct seeding approach to restoration. So the seeds are mostly not being used to grow seedlings. They're in nurseries. They're being planted directly on the ground. After this, the Jingo seed network, there were other seed networks that were generated. In 2008, the Amazonia seed network. There's also Cerrado seed network now. And there's now new seed networks all in different regions of the country that are all having a similar activity. They're linking training, management, governance, fundraising, marketing, and sales, and creating a business model that directly benefits the collectors and their communities. And these seed networks now have formed a redario, a network of networks that is facilitating their collective work. And it's been estimated that over 800 Indigenous people are directly benefiting from the redario activities, including groups that have been marginalized within Brazil. So this is really helping to support groups, quilombos and indigenous people, riverside dwellers, family farmers, and urban communities directly that have livelihoods that are linked with natural ecosystems and supporting those livelihoods. Now, another important way of role of governance is communication and linkage, and that can be done by platforms. So I'm going to show you two platforms which are at the national level. One is the Showcase of Restoration, or the Vitrine, and this was launched by Sobre, the National Restoration Association in Brazil. Hundreds of institutions have participated, and they provide important information about what their groups or their companies are offering in terms of the restoration value chain. So some of these are producers of seeds or suppliers of seeds or fertilizers, or companies that will actually come and do restoration on your property. They'll provide technical assistance. And this whole showcase is now in effect and working. And it was created by a task force that was a partnership between the Pacto, as I mentioned earlier, and also the Coalizão, the Brazilian Coalition for Climate, Forests, and Agriculture. And that's also one of the national level coalitions. I didn't mention them at the beginning, but they've been very important in stimulating a lot of these activities. And this is one that they're directly engaged with. And another one that they're directly engaged with is what is now called the Observatorio for Restoration and Reforestation in Brazil, which is a platform for mapping, restoration, regeneration, and reforestation in the entire country of Brazil. Again, the Brazil Coalition on Climate, Forest, and Agriculture was behind the development of this, which came out of one of their task forces. This is a hugely important effort and is probably going to stimulate similar observatories in other countries. And this is the transparency that we've been talking about. This is based on remote sensing, satellite information, high level, high resolution. So it's actually looking at what is happening on the ground and tracking the progress or lack of progress or the commitments that different groups have to restore throughout Brazil. And it's also tracking natural regeneration as well as more active efforts. So that was a big tour. Let me bring you back to sort of the central issues of governance that I mentioned at the beginning, because now that you've seen all this activity, you can really see how all of these activities are really representing good governance, democratic, transparent communication, respect for traditional knowledge, decentralized, inclusive governance, multi-sector engagement, consideration of multiple benefits and issues with restoration and reforestation, and they're linking actions at different levels to achieve polycentric governance. So you might ask, do we really need the federal government here? Of course we do. But these activities allow huge progress to continue to be made, even when the federal government is presenting obstacles. So in conclusion, to really reach the scale, either within Brazil or even globally, for restoring ecosystems, landscapes, and human well-being, governance should facilitate three types of scaling. Scaling out, which means kind of replicating models in different parts of the world or in different regions. Like we saw the replication of the multi-sector partnerships, the regional ones in Brazil. Scaling up, that is taking a small project and making it bigger. And scaling deep, which means really achieving broad cultural change within the regions to ensure long-term sustainability. So these scaling efforts really are fundamentally based on effective and very active participation by all the sectors, but especially rural producers, their representatives, and local communities. And if that is not part of the model, most of these efforts are not going to be successful, or they're not going to achieve the goals of restoration. So in conclusion, these diverse efforts underway in Brazil really demonstrate the critical involvement of all levels of government and all sectors of society. And they illustrate very well those three different courses of action that are defined by the UN decade. Building a global movement really requires building national and regional movements first, and providing national platforms for sharing knowledge information about all aspects, including monitoring information. And national movements really are built by regional coalitions. So we're now bringing this down to a much more local scale, where it's effective to bring together social actors and generate this political will to really change the way we're operating in the world and to reverse degrading practices and transform through restoration. And it's really important to realize that restoration cannot be achieved by individuals. It requires collective efforts by society. That is where governance comes in, and it needs to be supported by all levels of government and by the broader civil society and business sector as well. So really, Brazil has shown us through a very extensive and inclusive bottom-up process how multi-sectoral foundations can be built that allow all sectors to work together and to create a better future for everyone. So I want to thank you, and also thank these two networks that have been really important in developing these ideas. I hope I didn't go over my time.
Thank you very much, Robin. The talk was excellent. It was very clear, and you give us a tour into restoration in Brazil that was worth, really. We will leave the questions and the comments for after, and I shall now introduce Professor Carlos Perez. So, Carlos was born in Belém, Brazil, and was exposed to Amazonian natural history from age 7. For the last 35 years, he has been studying wildlife community ecology in Amazonian forests, the population ecology of key tropical forest resource populations, and the biological criteria for designing large natural reserves. He currently co-directs 4 ecology and conservation research programs in neotropical forests, including the ecology of key timber and non-timber forest resources, patterns of vertebrate assemblage structure in Amazonian forests, the biological dynamics of hyper-disturbed and fragmented forest landscape, and the biodiversity consequences of land use change. He has published over 400 papers on tropical forest ecology and conservation at scale ranging from population to landscapes and to entire continents. In 1995, he received a Biodiversity Conservation Leadership Award from the Bay and Paul Foundation, USA, and in 2000, he was elected an environmentalist leader for the new millennium by Time Magazine and CNN Network. He is currently a professor in conservation ecology and divides his time between Norwich and fieldwork at multiple field sites in tropical forests. He is also co-founder and science director of Instituto Juruá. So, Carlos, we give the floor to you. Now you can share your presentation. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Erika and Eraldo, for inviting me. And I think it's fitting that I follow Robin because I'm going to be talking a little bit about rewilding in the end in the context of ecological restoration. But in fact, I've actually changed a little bit the title of my talk because I was going back to back with Robin. So I wanted something a little bit more compatible. So I've sort of abandoned my earlier idea. And I'm going to be talking about defaunation and essentially rewilding in terms of refaunation in the Amazon and some of the broader issues. So why the Amazon? So obviously the Amazon is like over half of all remaining tropical forests. And everybody's heard about how important tropical forests are, 7% of the world's terrestrial area, but up to 70% of all biodiversity. Major influence on the global carbon cycle, up to 500 billion tons of carbon. A huge part of all terrestrial productivity, perhaps as much as 60% of all that terrestrial productivity, etc. And the Amazon is both the largest and most intact, despite everything you've heard recently, of all the tropical forest regions. The Amazon is also very large, so you could fit all 32 European countries there and leave a little bit of room to spare. And there's a context of relatively low human population density in most of Amazonia. So you're talking about 34 million people in the greater Amazon, which gives you a rural population density of just over 2 persons per square kilometer, which is a favorable context if you want to deploy conservation. So I'm actually going to be sharing with you a number of just some key points about some of the work we've done in the past and work that we're doing now. And in the context of conservation, we often think of things that are easily detectable from space, things like deforestation and forest fragmentation. Meanwhile, I would argue that there's a whole spectrum of anthropogenic disturbances that remain undetected and largely outside the policy agenda. So if you go through that little staircase there, you go from a fully intact forest to a forest that is perhaps defaunated but structurally intact, and then varying degrees of structural degradation until you're basically left with something like a cattle pasture. So very different scales of human disturbance, but the things that you can't see doesn't necessarily mean that they don't matter. So for example, in a review I did some time ago, you could argue that there are only a handful of things that are highly detectable from space, even using reasonably high spatial and spectral resolution remote sensing. Meanwhile, there are a lot of things that are only marginally detectable. And I would argue that many of the patterns of anthropogenic disturbance that essentially happen below that, underneath that forest canopy, remains undetectable. So if you can't detect, you can't map. If you can't map, it tends to fall outside the conservation agenda. And I say this about the Amazon within, a very strong paleo ecological and evolutionary context, because the Amazon has enjoyed a huge degree of geoclimatic stability, going back to the uplift of the Andes, something like 32 million years ago. So the Amazon has been essentially hydrologically protected by the Andes. And it's one of the reasons why forest cover has been relatively persistent throughout the basin. And then also the Amazon is as part of South America, the last major tropical continent to be colonized by humans, is still, relatively recent history of human contact. And this perhaps explains why, many of the species for different taxonomic groups that we find, not just in the Amazon, but other tropical forests, are essentially primary forest specialists. So essentially, if you replace that primary forest with just about any other land use, you tend to lose the vast majority of species. We confirmed that in a study some years ago that basically looked at 15 sites, including 5 sites of primary forest and 5 sites of mature secondary forest. And you can see for all those vertebrate, invertebrate, and plant taxa, the numbers of species that are essentially restricted to either primary forest in dark green or secondary forest. And these are up to 13-year-old secondary forests, relatively mature secondary forests, because most Amazonian secondary forests don't even live to their 4th year. And then if you think about the Amazon, what basically comes to mind is deforestation and various forms of structural habitat degradation, and understandably so, because that's what's most visible. And this affects perhaps 1/5 of the Brazilian Amazon. So going back to only 1970, before the first major highway was paved, linking the Brazilian Amazon to the rest of the country, that's what you had. Half of 1% of the Brazilian Amazon had been deforested. And then if you speed forward to today, we've lost something like 21% of that forest cover, plus another perhaps 30% in forest degradation of the remaining old growth forest cover. And much of that is due to the livestock sector, because cattle ranching in the Amazon still accounts for something like 83% of all deforestation across, at least across the Brazilian Amazon. Meanwhile, if you turn to the traditional populations of the Amazon, they have a relatively benign use of the forest. They have no will or know-how to essentially do large-scale land use change. And most of what they do is essentially extracting non-timber resources, including fish and game and a number of other things. And these are relatively benign impacts on the structure of the ecosystem. So the question is, how can we manage some of these activities, which are still prevalent in perhaps 4/5 of the entire Amazon? In this context, and I've been working on a lot of game vertebrates and hunting. And the first point I want to make is that many Amazonian terrestrial game species are actually very sensitive to game harvesting. Perhaps because of that relatively recent coevolutionary history with humans. So if you go back to the old empty forest argument, you can have a forest that is fully intact. Within perhaps just a decade, an overhunted patch of forest, hunted by only 1 or 2 households, can actually lose their harvest-sensitive component of that vertebrate fauna. So this is what I call a sort of a half-empty forest, because many species are essentially immune to hunting pressure. They're ignored by hunters, or they're relatively resilient to hunting pressure. In a review we did recently, based on over 1,000 mammal assemblages all over the neotropics, we find that if you look across all of those assemblages, the average mammal species in those assemblages has been reduced in size from 14 kilograms to 4 kilograms. So there's been a huge downsizing of those assemblages, and a depletion, an overall depletion effect of over 50% of that modern fauna. So we're not talking about the old Pleistocene fauna. We're talking about historical fauna that we inherited into the Holocene. So defaunation is a very pervasive process, not just in the Amazon, but throughout the neotropics. So I've been interested in these questions for a long time, and something like 35 years ago, I started conducting systematic line transect censuses all over the Amazon, not just in the Brazilian Amazon, but some of the neighboring countries. And these surveys are essentially, you basically go to a site for a month, and then you walk 3 transects between 4.5 and 5 kilometers for 3 to 4 weeks. And then from those data, you can derive reasonably robust population density estimates for a range of taxa. And the functional groups that we tend to work on are essentially diurnal vertebrates larger than 1 kilogram. But if you consider the nocturnal fauna, there's a huge degree of covariance in the residual aggregate biomass of these communities if you compare the diurnal against the nocturnal fauna. And these are all the sites that we have data for. And then the thing about these sites is that they're all structurally intact. So they've never been logged, they've never been burned, but they essentially experienced a very different history of hunting pressure. And then if you want to look at all of those sites and their respective density estimates, it's a good idea to pair them up to make sure that you're not comparing high versus low productivity sites in the same bag. And then if you do that, you find that there's a handful of species that actually benefit from hunting because there is a certain degree of density compensation or density undercompensation. So they're actually becoming more abundant in overhunted sites. And that tends to be the small-bodied species. But then there is a group of usual suspects of large-bodied vertebrates. They tend to be both large-bodied and low fecundity. That tends to decline severely in population densities. So often an overhunted site will only have about 1 to 2% of the population density of a productivity equivalent non-hunted site. And if those things are important in the ecosystem, then of course you've lost something like 99% of those populations to begin with. So, for example, if you look at large primates, which are the lowest fecundity of all the vertebrates, a large bodied primate like a woolly monkey or a spider monkey will only have about 6 babies in a lifetime. If you compare the size structure of those assemblages between non-hunted sites, where large body species are really dominant in terms of the biomass, against a heavily hunted sites, you'll see that oftentimes you basically lose all of that large-bodied fauna, and some of the smaller-bodied species actually become more abundant. And this applies to all sites that are hunted. So, for example, if you look at the harvest profiles of different communities as a function of human population density, you'll see that the structure of those profiles is changing very rapidly. Not before you get to 1 person per square kilometer, which is often regarded as a sustainable human population density. But way before that, by the time you get 0.1 person per square kilometers, at least in Amazonian terra firme settings, terra firme forest settings, you start having this massive change in which those low fecundity, large-bodied species are replaced by high fecundity, small-bodied species in the harvest profiles. So if you have nothing else, but if you have human population density, you can somewhat predict what is the residual vertebrate assemblage that people have around their villages. Then the other thing is that large-bodied vertebrates have this disproportionate impact on ecosystem functioning. In other words, they're not just a pretty face in terms of, many of the charismatic species that society tends to care about, but they also provide some real services in terms of the floristic landscaping, the functional engineering, seed dispersal, etc. So the idea that faunally intact communities tend to be associated with heavy wooded flora, in the sense that those forests have, on average, a higher carbon density, has already been tested for the neotropics, both for the Atlantic forest and the Amazon. So think about that transition between a faunally intact community to a community where large-bodied frugivores have been extirpated, and eventually perhaps some of those heavy-wooded tree species that essentially grow very slowly and die very late, as opposed to fast-growing species that die young, essentially represents those historically overhunted forests. I basically tested that idea for the Amazon based on a large number of tree plots. But the first thing we did was essentially map the depletion envelope that hunting causes based on every active household throughout the Brazilian Amazon. So essentially, we did exactly that using a bioeconomic model, which accounts for the source sink dynamics of every vertebrate species. And then I basically mapped out all the households that are no longer under forest cover. And essentially, what you're left with is a relatively small part of the Amazon that remains intact for that particular species. So here's an example for spider monkeys. So you can see that the degree of disturbance in terms of hunting for spider monkeys far exceeds the disturbance envelopes of any other form of anthropogenic disturbance. And then if you take that forward to the Chazdon Brazil Forest Inventory Network, these are the 2,345 1-hectare plots that are more reliable in terms of their floristic identification at the genus level. So we're talking about 128,000 plus stems, and these are trees that are at least 31.8 centimeters in DBH, because in the Chazdon Brazil program, they only sampled trees that were at least a meter or 100 centimeter in circumference, okay? And essentially what you can do for every one of these plots, if you know the diets and the patterns of seed dispersal by harvest-sensitive species, you can basically model the transition between a non-hunted and an overhunted forest for each of those plots. If you convert those plots into biomass, that's basically the above-ground biomass map that you get for the Brazilian Amazon in terms of that interpolation. So many areas are actually dominated by relatively few large trees that are heavy wooded or carbon dense. So you can see that there is a huge heterogeneity in the above ground biomass stocks of Amazonian forests. But if you consider all of those plots together, you can see that on average, these plots are essentially losing biomass over time. And this is if you exclude only the services of two species of large body primates, woolly monkeys and spider monkeys. If you then include the largest ungulate in the Amazon and the most frugivorous ungulate, tapirs, those patterns of carbon loss per plot increase further over time. And this is considering the diet of each of these things that's been documented over multiple studies. If you translate that into what that might look like geographically for that first scenario, where only the large body primates have been excluded, then you get that pattern there. So notice that there's a huge amount of heterogeneity in that dispersal bottleneck effect. And some areas that would actually increase in carbon are actually no longer with us. The message there is that most of the remaining Amazonian forest that has not been deforested to date is actually more sensitive to those seed dispersal bottlenecks incurred by hunting-mediated frugivore depletion. If you include the second scenario with the tapirs, then those patterns of carbon loss per plots becomes even more exacerbated, up to 25% of all the carbon over one tree generation may be lost if you remove only those three big players in terms of their day-to-day seed dispersal services. Okay. So my final point, which is much less gloom and doom than everything else I talked about, because here I'm essentially talking about an option to rewild whole landscapes in terms of their wildlife value. But, these historically overharvested populations of aquatic wildlife can actually recover surprisingly fast if you leave them alone, if you protect them from hunting, for example. And in these very low governance contexts, community-based resource management actually provides the best and perhaps the only available option for rewilding in terms of refaunation or trophic refaunation. So I'm not talking about the kinds of ecosystem restoration that Robin was talking about, which essentially relates to bringing back the structure and some of the species composition of these ecosystems. But I'm actually talking about the full complement of wildlife species that can come back through multiple population recovery trajectories. And historically, wildlife in the Amazon has been severely depleted, going back to the pelt trade in the height of the rubber boom. So hundreds of thousands of skins of all sorts of mammals were actually exported to Europe and North America. And this is essentially governed by physical accessibility. So in other words, if you are an aquatic vertebrate restricted to rivers, you're going to be most impacted simply because that's where most people are. And these are the areas that are most physically accessible. If you move further inland from these rivers, and so the Brazilian Amazon alone has something like 10,000 kilometers of navigable rivers. So, and that's still the primary means of physical access to hunters in this day and age. If you go further away from these rivers, that pattern of hunting pressure tends to decline as you get into more remote and more under-harvested areas. So this study essentially tries to recover the historical information on the annual harvest of pelts from all over the southwestern Amazon. So this is going back to the old diaries of individual trade posts. So there's a huge number of trade posts that were painfully recorded. And this essentially reconstructs the history of the pelt trade between 1904 and about 1970. And one of the things that this study shows is that all the aquatic vertebrates tends to be very heavily hit, even things that are relatively fecund, as opposed to species that are terrestrial and can benefit from source sink dynamics from areas that are not hunted or harvested. But, so that essentially leaves the question, so what happens to that aquatic megafauna if you discontinue hunting and you protect some of these things from subsequent harvests? And this is exactly what we've done. We've been working in the Juruá River Basin now for nearly 20 years. And this is one of the, it's a very large landscape, waterscape, where we work, because the Juruá, most people don't realize, is actually the second longest tributary of the Amazon, and we work along 1/3 of that river. So we work along 1,500 kilometers of the Juruá River Basin. And the question there is primarily, how do you manage these floodplain environments? And tropical floodplains are perhaps one of the most threatened tropical ecosystems, because that's where it congregates most people. They tend to be more productive. They tend to be more heavily settled. They tend to be more degraded, etc. And there are all sorts of resources being removed from these landscapes, which essentially happens under a context of very low governance. In the physical setting here, it's very important to mention that in most of these floodplains, the annual persistent flood pulse is very marked, up to 15 meters. And that flood pulse tends to last for about 6 to 7 months of the year. And these are some of the most seasonal, low latitude environments that you're going to find anywhere. So by some definitions of seasonality, these areas are actually more seasonal than the high Arctic. So you can see here a Varzea forest, a Varzea seasonally flooded forest under both during the flood pulse and the dry phase. And we essentially, very early on, we realized that there were culturally important species that people rely on, and all of those species had been very heavily overexploited historically. And the things that I'm showing you here are essentially Arapaima. These are the largest scaled freshwater fish on the planet. And then there's a whole complex of Porocnemis river turtles, including Porocnemis esponsa, the giant Amazon turtle, and then the smaller Uniphilis turtles in these environments. And these are very important, culturally important species, because they're not just food, but they're part of the very cultural integrity of all both tribal and non-tribal traditional peoples who live along these floodplains. So I'm talking about indigenous people, but I'm also talking about former rubber tappers. And so the first case study here is essentially community-based Arapaima management. To do that, you essentially have to zone very large landscapes, which is exactly what we helped people do along a large tract of the Juruá. And that's possible because you can essentially guard one of these oxbow lakes with a floating house or something like that at the strategic entrance to that lake. If you do that, it's impossible to enter that lake in the critical time of the year without somebody noticing. Okay, so essentially we have these three categories of lakes, which essentially forms a fishery spatial zoning system. Essentially, you have no-take areas, which are areas where they're never fished by anybody. Even subsistence fish is prohibited, but there is an annual windfall in Arapaima harvest because these are the lakes where they're doing the Arapaima management. And then there's another class of lakes, which are for local subsistence only, and people harvest those lakes all year round, but those lakes are not open to commercial fisheries from outside. And then finally, we have open access lakes, which are essentially open to everyone. So they're sort of all up for grabs. And both commercial and subsistence fishing can happen in those lakes. Well, it's easier said than done because it actually took many years to be able to do that process because you have to overcome a lot of barriers of suspicion to be able to zone, a very large stretch of a river. Right now, we are considering zoning up to 200 of these oxbow lakes, and these are not small lakes by any means. So if you compare those three classes of lakes, in the protected lakes, we have an Arapaima population size per lake of about 506. And the reason we know that is because Arapaima is essentially an air-breathing fish. It's not lungfish, but it has to come to the surface to breathe, otherwise it drowns. So you can exploit that to actually count the fish. And we've helped to develop a method for counting Arapaima, and we can essentially systematically train multiple communities to do that. In a subsistence lake, the Arapaima stock is only down to about 34 individuals, both adults and juveniles. In an open access lake, there are virtually no Arapaimas, about 9 Arapaimas per lake. And this, considering a very large number of lakes that we've censused over many years. If you look at what happens to these lakes once you protect the lakes from commercial fishing, that's the blue lines that you see in the top plots for both adults and juveniles. And by the way, fishermen can distinguish adults from juveniles just by the way they breathe. They come to the surface and breathe roughly every 15 minutes. You can see that lakes that are protected are essentially released. Their population size grows very fast, not just through internal reproduction, but also through dispersal. So safe lakes, they tend to receive more Arapaimas over time than lakes that are less safe for Arapaima. But if you combine both of those demographic processes, the rate of annualized population growth for protected lakes is absolutely phenomenal. And this can be seen if you plot the lake area against population size for both whitewater lakes and blackwater lakes. And that actually translates into money because these local communities can now afford to sell sustainably harvested Arapaima once per year. And that can mean very precious money for these communities that are otherwise very disenfranchised, very disadvantaged. So some of our communities can make as much as $40,000 in a single year. So huge financial benefits in engaging this whole process, protecting these lakes and zoning the whole landscape. And this essentially catches like a wildfire because all the other communities that are outside this management program now want to enter. So that essentially creates a big gold rush in which it becomes very easy to recruit new communities and new lakes into the process. There's also an incidental umbrella effect because lakes that are protected for Arapaima also protect all sorts of other things, including the freshwater turtles, including caimans and everything else. So on average, there's a tenfold greater number of freshwater turtles, 12 times more black caimans in these protected lakes compared to open access lakes. If you now turn to the Poroconemus turtles, that's also a very interesting case. So these turtles, they have to come up to egg lay oviposits in a fluvial beach once a year. Otherwise, reproduction cannot happen. And these beaches, they have to be protected. So these turtles are also a huge delicacy throughout the Amazon. Both the adults and the eggs are very sought after by all sorts of local communities. So in unprotected beaches, which is the vast majority of beaches, these turtles can never hatch any hatchlings. So you basically have beaches that are not reproductively viable over the long run. So to do that, what we did, we essentially traveled 1,500 kilometers of the Juruá, if you stretch those meanders, and we compared beaches that are protected against a neighboring beach, an adjacent beach that is unprotected. Essentially, we sort of matched a protected, unprotected beach, very similar physical setting. The only difference there is that one beach is protected by a little hut on the cup bank opposite that beach that is essentially guarded on a 24/7 basis. So there's got to be somebody there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And there are only 15 beaches that are protected out of 201 beaches along that 1,500 kilometer stretch of the Juruá. If you compare the nest abundance in protected beaches against unprotected, you can see that all sorts of beach nesting things do much better in protected beaches, including migratory birds, including iguanas, and of course the turtles. Essentially, for many of these species, it's virtually impossible to hatch any young in beaches that are otherwise unprotected. And there are huge incidental benefits or conservation dividends, if you like, to species that we never intended to protect in the first place. They're sort of non-target species, if you like. And that includes invertebrates in the beaches, caimans on the river right next to the beach, both species of dolphins, pink dolphins and gray dolphins, the large catfish, etc. So everybody's doing much better if you're associated with these protected beaches. And as a result, those freshwater turtle populations has been recovering in the process. Hundreds of thousands of hatchlings have been released from the protected beaches into the river. And we can see that there's a overriding effect of increasing turtle population sizes that is now contagious up and down the Juruá River. So here is an animation of what basically happens to an unprotected beach. So you start guarding that beach. Prior to that, it's essentially a dead beach because it's been over-harvested for decades. After 3 years, the first female turtles start coming up to egg lay, and here's your guard post in the cut bank, opposite side of that beach. This is a process that costs very little money. It's probably one of the cheapest site-based conservation efforts anywhere in the world. After 8 years or more, that beach is essentially repopulated by all sorts of things, not just beach nesting vertebrates, but other species, aquatic species that are associated with those beaches immediately nearby. And throughout that whole landscape that I described, those 1,500 kilometers of fluvial extent of the Juruá, all sorts of historically overexploited species are now recovering thanks to community-based management. And that includes all the aquatic species that are commercially valuable or historically exploited for their pelts or oil or any other products. That includes some of the large commercially valuable timber species, as well as important game species like the large-bodied primates, white-lipped peccaries, and tapir. And that is a consistent trend that we find for all of those aquatic, arboreal, terrestrial, and timber species. And I'm now approaching the end of this talk, but I just want to mention that this whole process actually returns real quantifiable socioeconomic dividends to those communities. So the communities that are inside protected areas that engage with this process, they now have better schooling, they have better access to market, better sanitation, much better access to healthcare, electricity, communication, internet connections, all of that. Also changes the demographic trends throughout the region. So people who are outside this process, they essentially want to leave their natal sites. They want to go somewhere. They want to go to a big city like Manaus. Whereas people who engage in this process, they basically want to stay. So there's a huge reversal in rural-urban migration, if you like, rural exodus, which historically has been a huge problem in Brazil because we cannot manage to hold on to people in the countryside in most of these areas. And this paper that came out in PNAS only 2 weeks ago shows that very clearly for the Juruá landscape. So we've done all this under the jurisdiction of the Instituto Juruá, which I helped to create with some former PhD students. You can check out the website if you like. And this is basically going from strength to strength because it's attracting a lot of attention. The consequences are that many of these activities are now in the process of being scaled up or scaled out, as Robin says. And then there's also a note about what happens in the tropics when you fund these so-called ICDPs, these integrated conservation development projects, because typically you can have an intervention that costs money, whatever that intervention may be. That could be in terms of financial investments, personnel, time, social political investments. That investment may pay off in terms of environmental gains, but rarely it pays off in terms of both the social and the economic gains. It's only when all three of these things win, if you like, that you have an ICDP that really works well for nature, but also works really well for local people, who, by the way, are the main agents in maintaining that whole process. So there is no exit point. There is no point at which we're going to leave that intervention and things are, pull the plug on the wall, if you like, and things are going to go back to to what they were. And then also, if these interventions are low costs, that's even better. And that's exactly what we are promoting through Instituto Juruá. So the scaling up across the lowland Amazon is already happening, both for Arapaima management and Porocanemas management. There are many lakes and beaches that are being brought into protection. And this is entirely bottom-up, essentially managed or co-managed by the nearest local communities. So if you're thinking about, scaling this up to a basin-wide conservation and development model, the things that we're trying to do is high-quality applied science, also biodiversity conservation in virtually intact ecosystems. We're also doing our own land purchase to create new biological reserves that can be managed by local communities, if that's possible, local community welfare, local food security, sustainable trade chains. We're also favoring local income. As a consequence of these activities, there's a much greater distribution across gender, so better gender equity, territorial security, because we're helping people to secure their own land against competing levels of often more predatory land use, greater autonomy in terms of the social politics and the cultural heritage of these local people, but also an overall integrated spatial mosaic of governance systems that is fairly stable and watertight over time, and it gets reinforced over and over again. So that's all I was going to say in terms of that, the Juruá example. And I guess when I accepted this invitation, I wanted to come up with something that was relatively positive. So instead of feeling overwhelmed and depressed about everything you've been hearing about the Amazon recently, the idea here is to have a greater sense of urgency and motivation to come up with workable solutions, and that's what we're trying to do with Instituto Juruá. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Carlos. It was a great talk. You just said what I wanted to say. Basically, on the first part of the talk, you said the very worrying thing about the decline of fauna in Amazonia. It was really bad if you think about it. But then you give us some hope with this initiative that I think is great, and it would be very good if it could be expanded to all the Amazonian basin, because it gives hope that things can change around. I thank you very much, and I would like now to give the words to the members of the panel to initiate the discussion. The students can do questions through the chat on YouTube, or eventually, I don't know if there are students here in this meet, because I see a lot of people. Maybe there are students here as well. Daniel, Reuber, and Geraldo, you have the word now.
Eraldo, do you like to begin?
I can. That's okay. Let's not waste the time. Well, thank you guys for the wonderful talks. I was very happy to listen about this very important possibilities to recover our degraded land and these positive ideas for the Amazon. And I have a question for Carlos. Carlos, how feasible should be to rewild the Amazon freshwater when we see so many dams being built in the Amazon, and even with plans to be building dams in the Andean region? I mean, so that's going to mess up the whole history. What do you think?
Yeah. So dams are essentially restricted to rivers on steep slopes because, from a hydrological standpoint, it doesn't make any sense to build dams on very flat rivers, meandering rivers. But it is true that there are something like 250 hydroelectric dams. They tend to flood smaller areas now than they did in the past, but they still cause a huge amount of damage to rivers whose channel are geologically stable and essentially flow on steep terrain. So there are huge, clashes in the conservation development priorities in the Amazon. And also, it's been mentioned repeatedly in conservation circles, a huge lack of political will. But for example, we work in a region where there is virtually no governance from the federal and state level, and yet you can come up with local governance to erect a resource management system. And even in rivers that are threatened by dams, that possibility remains open, provided that there are incentives, real incentives, tangible incentives for local people to engage in, let's call it conservation or sustainable development, whichever way you want to label it. But yeah, I think that the energy strategists in Brazil are largely barking up the wrong tree, and essentially they're going against history, if you like, because in most of the modern world, we're spending a lot of time dynamiting dams rather than erecting new dams. And we've known that doesn't actually make sense, even from a energetic standpoint. So, for example, Belo Monte now runs about half or one of its 18 turbines. Belo Monte was built at the tune of 40 billion reais, but it doesn't even supply 1% of the total power outputs that it was actually designed to do, because there's no sufficient discharge in the Xingu River Basin, and that's a small detail that they failed to consider. Yeah.
Okay. Can I ask Robin Chazdon? Thank you very much, you two professors, for these amazing presentations. Thank you, Robin, for giving us this picture of the good examples that are happening here in Brazil, the national, the platforms, the states, and arrangements we have here in order to improve, to upscale restoration here in Brazil. But in fact, I thought it is a little bit too optimistic, because these are examples. This is not what's happening in Brazil. If we compare the deforestation with restoration, it's sad to think about how much we are losing forests and how much we are in fact restoring. But it's good because we are learning in order to upscale when the wave of restoration comes to Brazil. And I think it's time to this wave of restoration. We are seeing financing of large areas of restoration. But my question is, how can we use this decade of restoration, the carbon sequestration financing, to respect those communities, to build these seed networks? Because to build these seed networks, we need time, we need engagement, we need to invest in social organization and social stuff in general to provide seeds from the grassroots, and not just buying large tractors, high technology, hiring some people, buying land and restoring the bunch of hectares we are planning to do. So how can we educate, if we need to educate the funders on biodiversity and not only carbon, and mostly, we can use the impacts of restoration for empowering people here in Brazil, which is a poor country, and it's really diverse country in terms of social wealthness. And a little short question is, how do you compare the restoration movement from Brazil with the poor countries and rich countries, if it's comparable, or what we have in particular of peculiar situation here? And thank you again.
Yeah, you brought up a lot of issues there. Let me just say that I have been really, really impressed by the kind of restoration infrastructure and development of these initiatives across the different regions of Brazil. And it is not the same in most other countries of the world, even richer countries that have resources. So it's hard to, from inside of Brazil, you see the problems. Yes, there are many problems, but from outside of Brazil, you see the huge lessons that we can learn from the way people have begun working together across sectors and across government levels in Brazil that are barely happening in any other parts of the world. For example, these multi-platform coalitions like the Pacto, most countries don't even have anything like that. So this is why it's important to point out what works, what has been working, and what sort of lays the groundwork for this real gearing up that you're talking about. These coalitions alone won't make things happen, but they create these enabling conditions for when society says, yes, we're going to do this. And when we mobilize that political will, the kind of infrastructure and the governance will be in place to make that happen. And we can't wait until that moment. We have to start now. And this is why pointing out these initiatives is so important. It doesn't mean that everything is wonderful, but Brazil has really, and I think, led the world in partly it's due to the federal initiatives that were taken in the 1960s and all the way through that require landowners to have responsibility for their land. That alone is quite unique. Most countries don't even have private land ownership. So the case of Brazil is rather special in that regard. And most other countries that have a lot of tropical forest resources, the forest land is all government or state owned and managed and controlled. And it's been very hard for the civil society to become as engaged as they should be. And it's sort of down to the very basic community level and village activities that are really happening.
Okay. I would like to thanks for the amazing presentations. I loved them. Carlos, I used to hear that your presentations sometimes are unpopular because you sometimes talk about how local people, traditional people, kill poor animals. And we are living now in a very sad moment in our country that there is a group of people that's saying that if you are planning to conserve nature, you are a communist. But if you are trying to do the traditional conservation using integral protection areas, you are just someone that lost all your social feelings and your heart. And you show that the best way to manage these questions is to improve the people, while you can use the traditionally exploited research for improve the gain of the people. But how can you engage the people at these local places for actively govern the use of the areas, choose the lakes, the oxbow lakes that they will not fish, they will not place that they will never take the eggs of the turtles. How much time you spent at this time with that? And I send you a photo that we take together 7 years ago in the chat in Honolulu. You can find it in the chat.
So you brought up a number of things there. So I've never held any romantic connotations about local indigenous people. I mean, people are people everywhere. And subsistence hunting can also drive harvest-sensitive species to local extinctions. So there is the distinction between commercial and subsistence hunting is primarily one of scale. So if you have lots and lots of people and you're essentially feeding, lots of mouths, then subsistence hunting can also be a problem and needs to be regulated. So but at the same time, I've written countless things about the importance of indigenous territories and things like that. So sometimes some of my early work, going back 30 years, is misunderstood by various people. But so in terms of the Juruá program now, none of the things that I described was particularly easy to achieve. I mean, I started working in the Juruá in 1987, and we've had full-time physical presence by investigators there since 97. So it's taken a huge amount of time to set up these fishing agreements, which in Brazil they're called the acordos de pesca, fishing accords, if you like, because, basically you have to involve local authorities, all the fishing syndicates, individual communities, and it could take years to persuade people that that's really the best outcome for everyone. So now, even the commercial fishermen that have been excluded from these protected lakes, they can see that they have much more fish all around because the demographic dividends of that whole no-take process and regulation of that spatial mosaic essentially benefits everyone. So just to give you one example, we are partly based in a small town in the Juruá called Karawari. Just last year, they consumed something like 30,000 freshwater turtles, which is unprecedented in the recent historical record. Equally, they're now harvesting, the most commercially valuable species that's worth, its weight in gold in places like Manaus, like tambaqui, the Colloquium macrocarpum. And even going back 10, 15 years, all of the tambaqui were undersized and very difficult to catch. And now we have large tambaqui that are highly abundant. They can be sold for as little as 10 to 15 reais. We're talking about a tambaqui that's, 80 centimeters in size. And fish has now become the greatest source of municipal scale revenue for the Juruá. It exceeds timber exceeds every other timber and non-timber resource. And that's basically, it's good for the county, the local economy. It's good for Social Security. It's good for everyone. Plus the fact that all of these people eating fish across the Amazon, for every pound of fish that you eat, you fail to eat a pound of bovine beef, which is incredibly damaging in food production systems, because it's not only a huge agent of land use change, but it's also a very powerful methane pump. So, for example, in Brazil, the bovine livestock sector is second only to, in the overall food system. It's second only to forest degradation and forest conversion as a source of greenhouse gases. So there are huge benefits, both local, regional, and global, of managing the acquisition of animal protein all around.
So, do you think that the presence of researchers in those places are a key for the success of the program?
Yes,
the relationship between.
Yeah, because the local communities where we work are historically disenfranchised. They never had a political voice. Essentially, what you're doing is giving them a voice and showing them the way. And then once they take those baby steps and they learn how to do things, then it becomes a lot easier. And gradually, they essentially take hold of the whole operation, and you can basically pull back and see it happening.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If there is no more question, I can ask another one.
No. Okay.
Okay. Well, I'd like to talk about hidden degradation. I mean, by this, I mean degradation that we cannot spot from the sky, from satellites. So I think that Carlos has shown very successfully that degradation is just increasing towards the interior of the forest, going to places that few people have been able to go. But when we talk about restoration, we start actually from zero, right? If you see a very degraded land. And how important it is to add functionality into restoration so we can correctly measure the success of restoration in Brazil.
Robin?
No, it's hugely important. And I would also stress that it's very open-ended in terms of the starting point for restoration and the end point of restoration. The idea is to improve the situation and to reduce further degradation or deforestation. So that could mean taking areas which are partially degraded, as Carlos said, and bringing them back to more full functionality. It could mean creating new kinds of ecosystems that are mostly providing for local needs and aren't necessarily going to have the full complement of biodiversity that relieves pressure for deforestation or excessive harvesting. So it means basically a whole spectrum. And in terms of forest restoration, this could be anywhere from, planting native trees to natural regeneration to agroforestry, different forms of agroforestry, silvopastoral systems. And it could mean, mangrove restoration. It's a whole range of activities. And the real key to the success of these is planning where and how each of those approaches is most relevant and most feasible, and most sustainable. And that must engage the local people in those decisions and sort of planning out the sort of ideal location spatially for each of these different interventions is really key to overall large scale success.
Thank you, Robin.
It would be nice to see some questions from there are half a dozen students in the audience, I guess.
Yeah, I do have some questions from the YouTubers as well, but let's give this privilege to the ones that are in the panel, right? So the panel. So go ahead, the ones, I don't know, there are several ones over here. So feel free to ask questions to now, and then I'll move to the YouTubers. So if there is no questions from you all, so there are some comments and some questions from the YouTubers. The first one is from Benhur Marimon from Universidade Estadual do Mato Grosso. He really enjoyed the presentation. Actually, there were about 40 people watching you all in your presentations and questions and comments. Just so you know, and Benhur was one of them. Thank you, Benhur, for being here. He really enjoyed your presentations, especially he has a question for Robin. So how do you see the future of restoration of degraded areas in the Amazon, looking inside of Brazil and outside?
Yeah, I think what Carlos said was really important, because in the majority of cases where forests and river systems and the whole ecosystem has been degraded, simply reducing the pressure and providing protection is key to the recovery, and it can be relatively rapid in many cases. So the real issue there is the planning process and engaging local people in the management and protection, and taking measures to reduce incursions and harvesting while forests are regrowing, things like that. It doesn't require huge costs. It really requires having a network of people who are committed to doing this. And in fact, I think it's better to not have payments to people, because you can't sustain those for very long. And many case studies show that when the payments are over, people tend to go back to what they were doing before, unless there's something better for them. So the idea is to shift the whole set of benefits that people receive from restoration, and that could be restoration in degraded habitats as well. And I think there's a huge potential for low-cost interventions that are fundamentally based on community management.
Nice. Thank you, Robin, for answering the question. So there are one more question or comment for you. It's from Maria Luisa. She's kind of comment and make a question together. So she thinks that this decade of restoration has been has better chance of success worldwide, given that the past global commitments failed to achieve most of the goals. I think she's giving like some example, like Kyoto Protocol and etc. I think it's just a comment. I don't know if you want to talk about that, Robbie.
It's a very important issue. Yes, we have to recognize that most of the IET targets failed as well, and these international initiatives have by and large failed, including the Paris Agreement, quite frankly. I think the UN Decade Strategy is recognizing that this has to become a global movement, and focusing on that strategy, focusing on the political will, and then focusing on the technical aspects are really designed to kind of mainstream this into all levels and all countries, and not make it this top-down process with targets that are basically unfeasible. In fact, the UN Decade doesn't have a specific target. They're trying to just encourage and promote all of the best activities everywhere. And I think that's good. I think the targets can be very distracting, and most people feel that they poorly value the right things also with some of the targets. So I agree. I think that most people recognize we need to operate with a new way of thinking and a new way of gauging expectations for the decade, and that's very much a part of the planning stages.
Okay, so we have one more comment, actually two comments from Laszlo Nagy. He's saying that we need to invite stakeholders from policymaking and implementation to these talks to take part of the extended panel discussions. I need to create a working interface with lawmakers to reduce the gap in understanding priorities for defining social environment objectives. I think he's just comment, and I don't know if you or Carlos Perez wanna comment those comments from Laszlo.
I have a quick comment, and then maybe Carlos, you can add to that. I didn't talk very much about two of the national coalitions. One is called Diálogo Florestal, and that has definitely engaged national level policymakers, at least in the past. And also the Brazil Coalition on Forest, Climate, and Agriculture has had a very active participation of state and national level policymakers. Currently, I think that's not so much happening with the national level, but it is still happening with state level. So the invitation is very open, I think, for their participation, and when they're ready to become involved, I think that the groups are very welcoming for them.
And I would just say that it's hugely important to broaden the debate and the dialogue with government and non-government agencies, including the environmental consultants and even biologists who work for the Federal Senate in Brazil and the lower house. So these are the people behind every law project, every projeto de lei, etc. So, yeah. But I think that in many countries, there is a huge gulf between discussions in academia and discussions in governments in terms of crafting creative solutions. And, so I think academia and applied ecologists have a huge amount to contribute. And sometimes they either their message goes unheard, or the message falls on deaf ears.
I think the situation here in the U.S. is very poor in terms of bridging that gap between applied scientists and policymakers. There are very limited opportunities to have these dialogues. It's really sad.
Mm-hmm.
May I do a question? It can apply to both you, Robin, or Carlos. It regards the fact that you say that we need to bring people together. And I wonder if how you try in your situation to create a dialogue between people that have different objectives, different interests, and so they are in conflict with each other. Did you have this kind of situation, for example, in the restoration field or in the conservation field, and how did you, if you at all found a way to solve them?
Carlos, do you want
well, maybe I can go second if you have something to say. Yeah.
Well, I have not personally facilitated that too much, as I mostly am working within networks that are fairly like-minded. But I do think that it's important to sort of depoliticize the issues. That is, to not frame the issues as part of a larger political view, but to get down to the really basic issue. Do you want clean water? Do you think people have a right to breathe clean air? Do you think nature has a right to exist? And these kinds of fundamental issues, you will get most people to agree. And then you start with that point of agreement and go from there. And I think that's the way. There's been a huge outreach to corporations. I know Unti.org has done this very effectively with a group of sort of elite corporations who are drafting very bold policies toward restoration and avoiding deforestation, and it is working. These companies are now kind of becoming almost more vocal about their commitments than our scientists. So that is a really huge thing that needs to be recognized, and following up on sort of how they've been able to get those corporations on board and sort of begin to speak with a single voice is really important, and it could be important for getting all kinds of groups on board.
Yeah,
thank you. Because there is, sorry, Carlos, just a little comment. Because I think that there are disparity between people that can have more voice and groups that have less voice, and then who is winning the conflict? Is it a power thing, or is it something more equal? You can go ahead. It was just a comment.
Yeah. No, I agree with everything Robin said, and essentially, you have to work with different sectors and stakeholders, and that's often very difficult in academia when you're sort of so busy chasing the next project and everything else. I mean, one strategy we've used, we've been partly successful, is with very successful press releases for meaningful papers that eventually find their way into some sort of policy arena. And in some cases, obviously, you have to be very attentive to any requests from policymakers or supporters of the supporting teams of policymakers. But by and large, in most countries, that dialogue between academia and the executive or the lawmakers, I think that fails miserably, and that includes the UK as well.
Excellent. I just have a question.
This is why I would just add.
Okay, go ahead.
I would just add one thing to what Carlos said, and that is that we really need to learn from cases where successful dialogues are happening and where they've actually had fruit in changing policies and changing sort of the panorama on the ground. And that's why I think understanding what is behind those successes is really important to think about.
Just to have a quick question for Robin and Carlos as well, regarding the environmental service payments. How do you see those payments for ecosystem restoration specifically? You hear about payments for an environmental service payments for like REDD Plus, whatever, but ecosystem restoration, not much. And how do you see that in the future in Brazil? If you have good chance of increasing. I have seen some, but not many, specifically for conservation. We can see some, but not for restoration. I haven't seen actually. I don't know your view. How do you see that?
Mm-hmm. Well, 3 of the programs. Oh, do you want to go first, Carlos?
No, go ahead.
3 of the programs I talked about are really based on using the payments, the Conservador das Aguas, Conservador da Mantiqueira, and also the Florestais. And they've been hugely successful, but I think we still don't have enough long-term data to know how those payments play out in the long run. But where you have most of the land is owned by farmers, you've got to engage them and provide benefits for them, at least initially, to get them engaged in the project. But there should be, I think, a transition plan eventually to sort of shift from that sort of incentive to other non-financial incentives. So I see that payments being very important during initial phase, but not forever. So there has to be a transition to a better system of incentives.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't think that PES, payments for ecosystem services, are very widespread in the rewilding cases, if you like, particularly tropical cases of tropical rewilding or restoration. But that's exactly what we're trying to do with, we have 2 cases of the beach guards. They are hugely undercompensated for their efforts. So we're going to be creating a system of payments for new beach guards and existing beach guards to bring in additional fluvial beaches into protection to initiate, turtle egg laying. And that's very important, particularly in the beginning. So you need to catalyze the process until there is a flow of benefits. Once that flow of benefits takes on, then perhaps you could even pull off the payments, however modest they might be, and then hope that the resource dividends from a more sustainable harvest is essentially generating subsequent payments. And the same thing goes for the Arapaima management. And that's a case where local communities are beginning to make quite a bit of cash. And eventually that cash also permeates into the local economy, the municipal economy, and so forth. So it's relatively easy to come up with a mechanism to bring new communities into new lake management schemes. But you're right that there are precious few cases of successful payments for what I would call sort of large-scale ecosystem restoration once perhaps the ecosystem remains structurally intact, but it's been defaunated. So essentially, you want to revert the population growth trajectories. You want wildlife population recovering on the right trajectory, and reversing those trajectories often will cost at least some initial financial resources. Yeah. I can't see Robin anymore.
She gone.
Erica, your microphone is off.
I think that she left. She said that she had only 5 minutes left, so she might be gone already.
Yeah. And so are you guys happy to wrap this up? Because I also have to go.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you, Carlos.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for the talk.
Yeah.
And,
so my pleasure.
And for accepting the invitation. It was great to be here.
My pleasure talking to you guys today. Okay, all the best.
Ciao, all the best.
It was amazing to have you here.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Hilber, Geraldo, Erica. Thank you, everyone, for participating in this colloquium. Okay.
Thank you,
Hilber.
Bye, guys.
Ciao. Take care.
Ciao.
Okay, guys.